Good morning, everyone. Lots of news to cover today. While you might have seen President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump, they met in the Oval Office yesterday. And Biden even said, "Welcome back" to Trump. Now, let me know your thoughts on that. It seemed like a very friendly meeting. The two of them had a very cordial exchange. The media then kind of went into a disarray, and both Biden and Trump just kind of sat there and smiled as they listened to the media. Let me know your thoughts on Biden's comment, also the welcome back. What do you think about it? Let me know. Folks, also, Trump's return to the White House will see many policy changes based on the proposals he made during his campaign run. He's told us a lot of what he's planning to do, right? One of the biggest issues he's now looking to tackle, again, is that of rising crime and the light on crime policies we've seen sweep the country. Actually, that's been one of Trump's biggest areas going all the way back to 2016, and things have kind of gotten worse since then. Remember, for example, when he called himself the law and order candidate back in 2016. Well, I'll be deep diving into Trump's proposed plans to fight back against rising crime. Now, let's dive into today's episode, but first, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us quite a bit, especially with the algorithm. So hit the like button. It helps us. Folks, now, President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump, they met in the Oval Office on Wednesday. Now, the two were very cordial with each other. It was a very friendly exchange, although Melania allegedly did not want to go to the meeting because she's still unhappy that Biden, the DOJ, of course, had raided Mar-a-Lago. Trump seemed to put some of that aside. Biden welcomed Trump back to the White House, and he said he'll facilitate a smooth transfer of power. Watch this.
Well, Mr. President-elect and former President and Donald, congratulations. And looking forward to having like we said, a smooth transition. Do everything we can to make sure you're accommodated, what you need. And we're going to get a chance to talk about some of that today. So
good.
Welcome.
Thank you
Back.
very much. And thank you very much. And politics is tough. And it's, in many cases, not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate it very much. And a transition that's so smooth, it'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that, Joe.
Meetings like this between presidents, they're not technically required, right? They're just kind of cordial things to do. They were actually common going back to the 1800s. Trump kind of broke that chain, though. He did not, again, meet Biden at the White House in 2020. And the reason was because Trump never conceded the election. Remember, he was challenging it. But this is significant. Biden does seem to be working on making the transition of power for Trump to be a smooth one. And it's something we have not seen in a very long time. Now, that said, though, in other news with the elections, the Republicans are now going to control both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate. That means they have a supermajority and control of all three branches of government, notably as well. They've completed the trifecta. This is very rare, right? And with the retention of the House, they'll also have relative control over the committees and the House investigations. With the Senate, they'll control the nomination processes for all of Trump's appointees. And with both of these, they can have strong influence over passing regulation, right? Different, of course, bills going through Congress and going to be landing on Trump's desk. But with all of this, it also depends on how closely aligned members of Congress are with Trump and with his agenda. The big question with Congress is, will they support Trump or will they inhibit Trump, right? And while the Senate, they just nominated the majority leader. This is going to be pivotal in that. That's Senator John Thune. He's a Republican from South Dakota. Now look, a lot of MAGA supporters, people really like Trump, they have noted that John Thune has not always supported Trump. He's actually come out against certain things. He's also stood by Democrats on some issues as well, including some of the race narratives and the January 6th narrative to an extent. And so there are some questions over how much he's going to actually back the MAGA agenda or whether he may block some things. Now, the South Dakota lawmaker has more recently backed Trump, and after being elected, he pledged to push President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet appointments and legislative proposals, suggesting he's going to move with Trump in terms of all of this. Is an important caveat here. Look, folks, in terms of the things people used to say and say currently with Trump, you can't really weigh things they said several years ago in terms of what their positions are, because a lot of them criticized him back in 2016. I'd say a lot of them did. The majority of them, maybe. And so people pull up his old quotes. It's not quite clear where he stands on this. Again, he is saying that he will support Trump's agenda, including notably on the nominations. But again, it's interesting because, it shows that while Republicans do have a supermajority, they didn't choose like a hardcore MAGA majority leader in the Senate, right? They didn't go as far as they could have. And they didn't choose somebody who was more likely to vote in ways that are, maybe in line with Trump. They chose someone who's technically more moderate. And in terms of the Republican Party, right, this is a majority leader that's a bit closer to the Democrats. Still on the Republican side, but more moderate by that standard. Now, on that note, Democrat Senator Chuck Schumer actually congratulated Thune on his nomination. And he's calling for bipartisanship in Congress. Watch this.
I congratulate Senator Thune on being chosen by his colleagues as the next Republican leader. I look forward to working with him. We've done many bipartisan things here in the Senate together, and I hope that continues. As you know, I strongly believe that bipartisanship is the best and often the only way to get things done in the Senate.
Now, in addition to that, Schumer also gave a warning to Republicans on being balanced within the recent power shifts, and he gave this in a speech also on Tuesday. Watch.
To my Republican colleagues, I offer a word of caution in good faith. Take care not to misread the will of the people, and do not abandon the need for bipartisanship. After winning an election, the temptation may be to go to the extreme. We've seen that happen over the decades, and it's consistently backfired on the party in power. So instead of going to the extremes, I remind my colleagues that this body is most effective when it's bipartisan.
Now, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Do you agree with him? Do you disagree with him? Let me know in the comments. I can kind of see two perspectives on this personally. On one side, I know that a lot of MAGA supporters are saying, well, look, the Democrats were talking about getting rid of the filibuster. They were trying to press for criminal charges against Trump and his entire family leading up to right before the elections. And, they were also ready to pack the Supreme Court. Should the Republicans show a more cordial nature in light of that? And the other argument is that, politics does tend to swing on a pendulum. It is the case. We have seen this throughout history, not even just U.S. history, even going back to the Roman Empire. When you push something to an extreme, it does tend to oscillate. History shows this over and over and over again. So do you agree it is a good decision if Republicans do become more moderate, or do you think they should hardcore just push their agenda? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. That being said, folks, in other news, there are announcements on new picks to positions in the coming administration. We're getting a better idea of what the Trump administration is going to look like. Congressman Matt Gaetz, he has been nominated as the Attorney General of the United States. Matt Gaetz is very, very much in line with Trump's policies. He was with the Freedom Caucus in Congress, meaning he was in Congress one of the individuals who, more closely aligned with Trump's agenda, right? Trump said in an announcement, quote, "Few issues in America are more important than ending the partisan weaponization of our justice system." And he said Matt Gaetz will end weaponization of government, protect our borders, dismantle criminal organizations, and restore America's badly shattered faith and confidence in the Justice Department. He said it on the House Judiciary Committee, which performs oversight of DOJ, Department of Justice. Matt played a key role in defeating the Russia hoax and exposing alarming and systemic government corruption and weaponization. He is a champion for the Constitution and the rule of law. Gaetz previously has given statements calling for the abolition of certain government departments as well. He's also, again, been at the forefront of exposing, of course, what Trump would call the weaponization of justice. and what could be many abuses of power. And that's going to be important because in terms of Trump's agenda, looking at government corruption, looking at alleged abuses of power, with Matt Gaetz in that role, he would very likely advance that, very strongly, very likely. For Secretary of State, Trump has nominated Senator Marco Rubio. Rubio is going to be in charge of U.S. foreign policy. And this is going to be interesting because Rubio, again, I do oppose the Chinese Communist Party. Rubio has a very strong record of being tough on the CCP. He will very likely carry that torch. He will very likely go after the Chinese Communist Party in many different regards. And that'll be important too when it comes to the trade wars. It'll be important when it comes to dealing diplomatically with the Chinese Communist Party, when the CCP method tends to be getting other countries to sign agreements, violating the agreements immediately, but then holding the other country to account of what they signed. That tends to be their modus operandi. It's very likely that Rubio will see through that because he's been very strong against the CCP. Now, Trump said in a statement, quote, "He will be a strong advocate for our nation, a true friend to our allies, and a fearless warrior who will never back down to our adversaries." And also, Trump has nominated Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. Trump said in a statement, "For over 2 decades, Tulsi has fought for our country and the freedoms of all Americans." Now look, we're still waiting on announcements to other key positions. We're getting a clearer picture of what the projected administration will be. All of these individuals, they still need to be approved by the Senate. Remember, these are nominations. It does not necessarily mean they've gotten these positions. But again, the selected Senate Majority Leader has suggested that he will advance Trump's nominations. Although, again, it might depend on who it is because we don't know the whole cabinet yet. So we'll see. Now, on the point of policy, I want to go deeper into what we'll likely see once Trump does take office. As you've been watching the show recently, I've been going over his different policies for the past few days. And back in February of 2023, Trump detailed what his policies will be on fighting crime and also on restoring rule of law. Watch this.
Here's my plan to restore law and order in our cities and throughout our country, frankly. First, because police forces have been gutted by Democrats' war on police, I will sign a record investment in hiring, retention, and training for police officers nationwide. So important. This bill will also increase vital liability protections for officers because the Democrats want to take those protections away from our police because we want them to do their jobs, and we want them to do their jobs right. You can't take their protections away if you're going to have them do their jobs properly.
Now, this was one of the bigger debates with the defund the police movement. People were saying police had relative legal immunity, and so a lot of protections for police, they removed it, right? They made it so that victims of what they called police brutality could turn around and sue the police. And some people would say, well, that stops corruption taking place. There were systems in place for it. But now that they've removed some of that immunity for police, what has happened? Well, in some areas where they've done this, police officers risk getting sued anytime they try to stop a crime. And if you're a police officer and you're arresting, 5, 10 people a day, or, you have to they call contact people a certain number of times a day, and let's say one person a day sues you, and they need to be personally liable for that, what's the result? Well, look, the result of it is a lot of police do not want to risk their own well-being if it means dealing with someone like that. If it means that they're going to approach somebody and the person is probably going to try to sue them, and because of the way that the justice system has been working recently, it is kind of stacked against police in some areas. Police, as we have seen, seem to be a little less willing to contact people like that. And so a lot of lighter crimes, they don't go after them. Not all of them, but it does happen, right? Some police officers, because of this, they're retiring early. They're just going for early retirement. And people who may have wanted to become police officers are just not doing it. And so you have a shortage in police officers in many parts of the United States. Now, this is creating holes in law enforcement, and we're watching what that looks like. Now, The other side is, right, different police departments also have different standards on training. I've personally talked with officers who said that these are actually problems, right? Some of them would acknowledge this, that you go to some counties, they have very good training. They're trained like really well. You go to others, the training, the process of getting it, it's not as strong. Oftentimes the sheriffs will have stronger training. The city police departments maybe not as much, depending on where you go. New York City has a very good record with training, for example. But look, the problem isn't so much money on that front. The problem for training is too little money, some would argue. And that was one of Trump's big arguments, is that you shouldn't remove funding. If you want to make policing more effective, you give them more money, but you put the money into training. And that was the argument. Now, Democrats have also done that. The left has also done that. But the training they get tends to be more like race training and identity training. And for example, in California, if police arrest a person, they're supposed to like submit a paper, and the ACLU and stuff is tied into this. They have to submit a paper where they have to say, what is the gender identity of the person you arrested? What do they identify as? Or what do you believe they identify as? What is their race? And so police have to submit these reports based on the race and gender training they've been forced to get. And so just saying training isn't a one-size-fits-all. The type of training has a lot to do with it, because the type of training Trump's talking about and others are talking about have to do, for example, with dealing with riots, dealing with, for example, unruly individuals, target shooting, house clearing, that type of thing. Now, Trump has also called, interestingly, for return of common law enforcement measures. Watch this.
Second, to qualify for this new funding and all other Justice Department grants, I will insist that local jurisdictions return to proven common sense policing measures, such as stop and frisk. Very simple. You stop them and you frisk them. Strictly enforcing existing gun laws against convicted felons, cracking down on the open use of illegal drugs, and cooperating with ICE to get criminal aliens off our streets and get them out of our country.
Now, Trump was actually talking about using similar approaches to policing before. This is not like a new narrative, technically. Remember, for example, the federal government, they do not control the police. Sheriffs are elected officials. They actually have relative autonomy, and they would be considered one of the checks on power at the local level. You have, of course, district attorneys, sheriffs. You elect them. And if a sheriff, even if they're in California, if they do not believe that the laws being enforced are constitutional, the sheriff can choose to not enforce it. Police are different. Police departments tend to be with the cities, and they tend to be regulated by local policies, including, for example, through the local mayor. Because of this, some cities have changed their policies on policing. You have different standards of police depending on where the officers are from. Officers, for example, in many cities, they cannot deport illegal immigrants. They can be punished by the city if they do it. Some have more restrictions on how they enforce the law. And keep in mind with the deportations, it's a handoff. They normally have to hand these individuals off to ICE, who are federal, and then ICE deports them. The cities have restricted police from doing that. Police can be punished for it in major cities. Now, as a way to bring back law and order back to cities and states where crime is becoming a problem, what is Trump talking about? Well, previously, he was discussing this as well. He was talking about withholding funds unless states start having the types of law enforcement standards that Trump is talking about in this video. Remember, for example, during his previous administration, Trump was even suggesting that he may deploy federal marshals to enforce the law in some of these areas. He even suggested that maybe he'll deploy the National Guard. That was, of course, in light of the BLM riots and some of the Antifa-type riots we were seeing, wherein a lot of people said that shop owners, store owners, even individuals were not being protected against the riots and violence, killings and lootings. And Trump was suggesting that maybe he needs to put, federal security in place to protect Americans from that. Now, with that said, we will probably see more legal debates on police procedures. This is probably going to be a very big topic going forward. I will note, if you were to go back to the Clinton era, right, Bush and Clinton type eras, Democrats used to be very tough on crime also. I know these days it's painted as more of a kind of a divisive issue. Democrats used to be tough on crime. Kamala Harris was, tough on crime. She was putting marijuana users behind bars. Hillary Clinton was talking about, super predators. And I know that oftentimes that's framed as, that she was going after black Americans. The real context of that was she was talking about repeat offenders and violent criminals. Oftentimes, crime is committed by the same individuals. I don't mean race, I mean like the actual same people. You might have an area with high crime, but it's only like 20 or 30 people, and it's just these repeat offenders, right? That's the context of it. And so the tough on crime arguments were going after the repeat offenders, the individuals who, again, I'm not talking about race here. It's actually, I know in some areas in California, it's like the homeless population committing like 70% of the crime, for example. In some areas, it's certain gang members who commit most of the crime. But again, certain groups who tend to be just, maybe 10, 20, 30 people committing a large amount of crime. Take, for example, Tren de Aragua. You don't have a lot of them. 100 known, 100 tracked, and about 600 affiliates across the entire country. And they're causing a lot of crime. It's not a lot of people, but it doesn't take a lot of people to cause a lot of problems, right? That was the debate with the 3 strikes law. That was the debate going after repeat offenders. Democrats used to be just as strong on this as Republicans were, but the narrative changed. And of course, the parties changed quite a bit over time, and so the narratives in terms of parties changed as well. And that's where we are now. Trump is kind of pushing for policies that Democrats used to push, actually. Now, on this note, there are other things like stop and frisk. Some of these are going to be debatable in terms of the Constitution. Now, stop and frisk was a New York policy, you might remember. Mayor Giuliani put that in place. That was part of his broken glass policy. And the context of broken glass policing was every crime is prosecuted. If you rob a store, you're prosecuted. If you do drugs, you're prosecuted. If you break a pane of glass, you are prosecuted. Every crime is prosecuted. And as part of that, they also rolled out stop and frisk, where a police officer could stop anybody and frisk them. Now, it was effective, right? Technically, it did make sure that people didn't have guns. It kept a lot of that off the streets. They were able to go after drug users and drug dealers. Yes, that took place. But there were also some legal debates on it, especially as it relates to the constitutional protections on your rights against illegal searches and seizures. And the argument was, well, they're frisking you, they're not searching you, meaning they can pat the outside of your clothes. They can't shove their hands in your pockets unless they have probable cause or unless they get a warrant, right? That was some of the arguments with that. Very likely if Trump brings back these policies, there will be legal debates. There will be a lot of legal debates on whether these can stand up or not. But aside from policies and police training and funding, right, there are actually a lot of other issues as well. Even if police can fully do their jobs in some areas, even if the local sheriffs are very strong on crime, and even if they're sending them out and they're basically just enforcing the law as normal, it doesn't necessarily mean that criminals are going to jail. And the reason for this, right, even if they can fully do the jobs, is because there are prosecutors, these DAs, right, who enforce soft on crime policies. And this is one of the discrepancies you find in some areas. Even where you have strong law enforcement, in some areas, if the prosecutor is one of these soft on crime, prosecutors, then people just kind of get let out on the streets again soon after being arrested anyway. They don't go to prison. Now, a lot of the campaigns for those prosecutors, these soft on crime ones, they were funded, right, by billionaire George Soros. And George Soros talked about this publicly. It's not some conspiracy theory. He actually wrote about this in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal back in 2022, right? He said this publicly. And essentially, he said that he wants to see more, quote, racial equity when it comes to how criminal cases are handled. Soros's argument was there is a discrepancy in the numbers. More black Americans are in prison, fewer white Americans are in prison. And so he was saying that policing should keep racial equity in mind as they go about their jobs. Now, the issue is, how do you achieve that, right? How do you create equality of outcome? Not equality of opportunity, right? Equality of outcome is what equity is, meaning that no matter what you do, you end up with the same result. How do you do that, right? When it comes to the consequences of crime based on each person's race. Because technically, how do you control whether a person commits crime or not? Well, the criticism in some cities, like here in New York, for example, is that that type of policy, that type of, light on crime policy depending on race, has led to a kind of revolving door for crime. A lot of crime seems to have little risk of punishment. And this also includes young criminals, kids 14, 15, 16 years old, who will steal cars. Tren de Aragua, for example, has been recruiting kids like 14 years old to go and hold people up and rob them at gunpoint in Times Square. And that's been going on in New York. And the reason for that is because they want equity, they want lighter on crime policies, and so they made it so that minors, anybody under the age of 18, does not go through the normal criminal justice system. They go through family court, and so they can rob somebody at gunpoint and not go to jail for it, basically. Also, they've gotten rid of, cash bail, meaning that people are, as soon as they're arrested, even if it's a serious crime in some cases, they're just let right back out on the streets. Now, Trump says that he'll take action against the prosecutors pushing these types of agendas. Watch.
Third, we will go after the radical Marxist prosecutors who are abolishing cash bail, refusing to charge crimes, and surrendering our cities to violent criminals. They have surrendered like never before. I will direct the DOJ to open civil rights investigations into radical left prosecutors' offices, such as those in Chicago, LA, and San Francisco, to determine whether they have illegally engaged in race-based enforcement of the law. I will also work with Congress to give the victims of their Marxist policies the right to sue local officials for harm and suffering, and it has been great that they have caused. If your small business is pillaged because shoplifting goes unpunished, if you're brutally attacked by a violent felon released without bail or bond, then you will be entitled to massive damages.
Now, in terms of launching federal investigations into whether prosecutors have been using racial discrimination on how they enforce the law, that would be big. Keep in mind, again, that Trump has now nominated Matt Gaetz to be in charge of the Justice Department. He is going to be the Attorney General of the United States if the Senate approves him. And him being a senator himself, that may go through. Briefly on that, some of you may be wondering about what happens with the approval process for that. Matt Gaetz being a senator, of course, that means he would be leaving his Senate position. For senators, if they get nominated and they're accepted and they're appointed to a White House position, the governor of the state gets to appoint the replacement. And so in that case, the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, he would be able to appoint Matt Gaetz' replacement in the Senate during that time. There are different rules in this depending on where they come from. If you're a House member, for example, and you're appointed, there needs to be an election process, just as an example. So Gaetz, again, being a senator, it would be on the governor. Now, but back to this point, though, because Gaetz probably, based on his track record, he might actually enforce this. He might actually go after these woke DAs, as people call them, right? And of course, if the federal government is launching investigations into prosecutors and whether they're using racial discrimination on how they enforce the law, that would be big, right? Because a lot of these prosecutors have actually said as much publicly. A lot of them have made public statements along those lines. And if people are being held to different standards of the law based on the color of their skin, that actually could violate civil rights laws. The issue, of course, with civil rights laws in this country is civil rights laws in our Constitution make it so that the federal government or government employees cannot discriminate based on race, gender, so on, right? But the way that some of the laws have been applied is that they kind of write off straight people, men, and white people. And the allegation is a redefining of what constitutes racism. In fact, a redefinition of the word racism in and of itself, where it's not actually about race anymore, it's about social economics. And so the argument is that, you can't be racist against white people. That's the argument. The problem that people have argued they're going to face, though, is that that's not what the law says. The law would be on the side of Matt Gaetz if he is appointed to this, that if you discriminate against white people, that is still racism. And using a government position to do that could be a civil rights violation. Matt Gaetz actually could do this, right? Now, that being said, folks, the second part, allowing victims of crime to sue local officials over crime policies, that could be pretty broad, right? That could actually be really broad. Some cities, like New York, for example, and California, for example, they've been reducing the consequence of things like theft. In some parts of California, you can steal over $900 of goods from stores and face very little risk of prosecution. This is why, for example, if you walk around Manhattan and you go to a Walgreens or a CVS, you'll see that they've hired private security. You'll see that they have all their goods behind like glass, and you need to push a button to ring a cashier to come help you open it if you want to buy deodorant or anything else like that. Because, again, they're facing a lot of small crime like this. A lot of areas, like New York, for example, they've gotten rid of cash bail. That means that criminals, they're arrested and they're let right back out on the streets. And what happens? Well, a lot of them just go right back into crime. Sometimes what that means is that a criminal gets arrested, sometimes even for serious crimes. They go back out on the street and then they harm somebody. They rape somebody, they kill somebody. That actually happens quite a bit. And so what Trump is proposing here is to allow the victims or the families of the victims to sue the officials who have advanced these policies. The officials who, by extension of that, led to them being harmed. Now, that would be something new. We would have to see how that would work legally. The irony in this, though, the really ironic part, is that they could technically make a legal argument for it using the same argument that has been used to remove the legal protections for police, because it's technically the same thing. And so in many states and cities where they've done that, where they've made it so that police can be sued by people they've contacted, that also using that same legal argument could extend that to the officials who've created the policies that allow these individuals to be harmed. We'll see how it works. We'll see if it even happens. But it is possible, actually, and there is potential legal basis for it because of how they've done that in other areas. Now, folks, Trump also aims to dismantle gangs in drug dealing. I'll be talking about how he plans to do that after we come back from a quick break. And just a small correction, Matt Gaetz is a representative, not a senator, so I apologize for that. But don't go anywhere. We'll be back in less than 1 minute. Meanwhile, hit that like button, leave a comment, and we'll be back soon.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low-price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. We could see some major changes to this country and some of the laws here based on what Trump has said he's going to do when he was running for office, again, now that he is president-elect. Now, one of the biggest issues he's looking to tackle is that of rising crime. And back in February of 2023, Trump detailed what his policies are going to be on fighting crime and on restoring law and order. And one big area he wants to tackle is gangs. Trump is aiming to dismantle gangs, drug dealing, and go after the cartels. Watch this.
Fourth, I will order the Department of Justice, or some people call it the Department of Injustice right now, and Homeland Security dismantle every gang, street crew, and drug network in America. Every single one of them will be dismantled. We already know where these turf wars and drug dens are. We know who the people are. And we're going to charge them and charge the culprits with every crime that we can find. We're going to be fair, but we're going to be tough. We also need the death penalty for drug dealers. So important. And I'd add to that human traffickers. Drug dealers and human traffickers, they get the death penalty. Watch it stop and stop quickly.
Now, gangs are actually a bigger problem than maybe a lot of people realize. Crime, at least major crime, tends to be committed by what a lot of police officers refer to as regulars. They're the regular clients of the local police department. A lot of times a small crime is more on like mentally ill people, a lot of times in the homeless communities. And so areas with the homeless populations, a lot of it's going to be on them. I know some parts of California you're looking like 70% of crime committed by the homeless community. But major crime, I'm not talking about petty crime, major crime, at least in terms of repeat offenders, tends to be through gang members. A lot of gangs have become very powerful in the United States. They act with corruption, corrupting local officials, getting people in their pockets and so on, especially with drugs. There's a lot of money in drugs and there's a very large network tied in with the drug trade. And also now with mass illegal immigration, there's also a lot of money in human trafficking. Human trafficking has now become a major, very, very lucrative industry. And keep in mind, if we go by the NIH, about 107,941 Americans were killed by drug overdoses in 2022. That's a lot of people, folks. Over 81,000 of those Americans who were killed were from opioids. That was just 1 year. And it's like that year after year after year. The Chinese Communist Party is also tied in with the drug trade. There were international organizations operating on this, terror networks tied into it, a lot of things. And a lot of these operations, notably, were started under former CCP leader Mao Zedong, which he modeled against, as a war against the United States, using the opium wars as the kind of, the back for it, the kind of the foundation for it. For them, for the Chinese Communist Party, for America's adversaries, the drug war is a form of war. In fact, in the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare doctrine, they refer to it as drug war. They regard it openly as a way of killing Americans, and killing Americans, notably, on a level comparable to a very large war. The annual death of Americans is equivalent to the number of young men we would be losing on a battlefield if we were involved in a major war right now. A lot of Americans are dying from it. Now, a key question, though, is whether Trump could actually enact a policy to go after these organizations. How would you go after gangs, and especially some of the more powerful ones like the drug cartels? The drug cartels have become more active in the United States as well, notably because of the light on crime policies, because of the open border policies, but also because of the policies in some areas which have legalized or decriminalized drugs, meaning cartels can set up shop in the United States with very little risk to themselves. That means we're starting to have those things here as well. Well, Trump actually announced a policy on this. Watch.
Fifth, in cities where there has been a complete breakdown of law and order, where the fundamental right of our citizens are being intolerably violated, I will not hesitate to send in federal assets, including the National Guard, until safety is restored.
So in other words, we could see the military deployed to fight crime. It's not clear whether things would go that far. It's not clear whether it would actually be necessary to bring it that far. But look, already this is happening in some parts of the United States. In New York, for example, the National Guard has already been deployed for security in the subways. It's kind of funny though, because they don't have, it doesn't seem like they have ammunition in their guns. But this may not be as far-fetched as it sounds to deploy the military on the streets to enforce the crime, because again, we're already seeing it in some areas. Now, as Trump's sixth policy on crime, he said he's going to try to fix the gang problems that start in schools. For that, he's going to order the education and justice departments to overhaul federal standards on disciplining minors. This will not just be in the schools. This will be for minors who commit crimes overall. And this is important because, as I've been discussing, a lot of gangs right now, they recruit young teens. Kids who are like 12, 14, 15 years old, they use the kids to commit the crimes, including carjackings, including armed robberies, because there's not much consequence for the kids if they get arrested for it. They're kind of the easy way of committing crime. Trump also said that he's going to sign concealed carry reciprocity, which will make it so that if you have a concealed carry permit for a firearm, like you can carry your pistol around, that will apply between states. So if you're in Florida and you have a concealed carry permit, you can go to California and you'll still be protected. You can still have your concealed carry. That's what Trump is trying to do. Very likely you're going to see legal challenges on that because Governor Gavin Newsom has said that he's going to be trying to push back against a lot of Trump's policies. And so there's going to be a lot of battle at the state level over whether these things are legal or not. But get ready for it, because this is what's coming, folks. Back to the gangs and drug cartels, though, and the possibility we could see the military deployed to enforce the law. Trump's last part on this law and order agenda could actually be on this. Here's what he says he's going to do. Watch.
In addition, I will, of course, fully secure the border, dramatically increase interior enforcement, and wage war on the cartels. We have never had a border so secure as it was just 2 years ago, and now our border is the worst anywhere in the world and possibly of all time. There's never been a country that allowed to happen what's happening in the United States right now, where millions of people are pouring across our borders.
Now, declaring war on the cartels would be significant. There's been criticism and support for that on both sides of the aisle when it comes to American politics. Some of the arguments are that if Trump were to wage war on the cartels, that would cause problems with countries like Mexico. And the problem you have, just to be frank, is that a lot of public officials in various countries throughout Latin America are involved with the cartels. The cartels are very, very deeply entrenched in some areas. In some parts of Mexico, the cartels are the government. They actually run the hospitals, they run the social services, they have their cartel members become and run for office, and they control the areas. You have entire parts of the countries controlled by drug cartels. Go to other countries in Latin America, some of them, for example, have just narco culture. It's become embedded in the countries. And so waging war on the cartels would be huge. Let's put it that way. Trump has actually released a whole separate campaign video explaining his policies on how he's going to do this. We'll see if he can actually do it. There have been talks again in Congress about declaring the cartels a terrorist organization and basically going after them in the same way we went after Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the Taliban. And some would argue that the way that ISIS or the Taliban function is very similar to the cartels. A lot of people, ask a veteran, if you went to Afghanistan, basically everybody had some ties to the Taliban. It's the same thing in a lot of Latin America. Almost everybody knows somebody or has a family member who's in the cartel, or at least is tied to them. That's how it is. And it's because they're so deeply entrenched within the society. The cartels, of course, are paramilitary organizations they're about as well armed as the Taliban was, right? Some would argue maybe even a little better armed because they have better firearms. They're not dealing with like old Soviet-era guns and stuff like that. To go after them, Trump is saying that he will use special operations raids to go after and kill select members of the cartels, break up their operations, and destroy them. He's going to set up a naval blockade to block the entire drug trade. He's going to use the entire intelligence system to monitor them, treating them like terrorists, monitoring conversations, targeting them, and destroying them. And on the point of foreign officials who may have cartel ties, I mentioned that that is one of the things that he would probably have to deal with. A lot of governments in different countries at the local levels, you're going to have a lot of people who either have ties to the cartels, are getting paid off by the cartels, or who are living in fear of the cartels. Trump said publicly that if any leader, he didn't say foreign or domestic, he just said any leader, if any leader tries stopping this, Trump said that he will expose their connections to the cartels. And if they're carrying out large-scale intel gathering, monitoring all this, they're going to have the information on it. On that note, Trump is suggesting, based on that he might not go after all the public officials tied in with the cartels unless they block him from destroying the cartels. And if they block him again and he exposes it, then they'll be named as basically terrorist collaborators, depending on whether he deems them a terrorist organization or openly declares war on them. He says he's going to do this. He released an entire separate video detailing a very large plan to go after them. Now, look, we'll see whether he actually does that. Again, this has been talked about before in Congress. Some Republicans want it, some don't, meaning that even among Republicans, even within the Trump team, this may be controversial. We will see whether it actually happens, but he is saying he's going to do it. Now, alongside that, we're also likely going to see mass deportations, which Trump also mentions here. Now, and that's important again, because a lot of individuals who have come to the United States, the more legitimate ones, many of them are either fleeing socialism, like Venezuelans and Cubans, right, getting away from communist policies, or they're fleeing drug violence and so on. A lot of them are fleeing gangs and cartels. And so if Trump is going in and helping countries destroy the cartels, and keep in mind, some countries are actively trying to do this now. For example, if you go to Argentina, for example, if you go to El Salvador, even Ecuador now, many countries within Latin America are actively trying to crush the cartels and gangs, meaning Trump could have mixed support or opposition within the Latin American region. Now, folks, let me know your questions. Leave them in the chat. Hit the like button, and also please share this episode. Crossroads has been censored since January 6th. And so we're trying to build back. I think it's actually changing now. A lot of websites that were suppressing us before, they seem to be kind of letting their foot off my neck, so to speak. And Crossroads is coming back up, thanks to that. It seems a lot of them are maybe concerned that censoring people based on their opinions is not the best way forward. And so again, share this video. It does help us with the algorithm. Like this video, it helps us a lot. And leave your questions in the chat because we'll jump into questions now. All right, let's see here. Mockingjay, you're saying, what do you think about these Democrat governors wanting to form an alliance to stand up to Trump? Let's just be honest, right? Let's just be honest. Republicans did the same thing to Biden, right? I think that's normal practice. I think you can expect it. When it comes to Democrats right now, Governor Gavin Newsom is calling members of his state, right, the state legislature, different bodies of the state government, and he's looking at ways to fight back legally using lawsuits to go after things if the federal government tries getting involved at the state level. And he's also notably looking to defend California if they get sued. Now, this is an argument that's been going on for a very long time in the United States. Where do the rights of the states end, and where do the rights of the federal government begin? The balance between federal rights and state rights has been an argument like literally going back to the founding of the United States. Came to a head, of course, during the Civil War, but even going back to the founding of the United States, you can read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers on the arguments for it. America, before we had the federal government, America actually was we were a confederacy of states. Meaning, of course, every state was basically a country and a government. And, of course, each individual country had a relation to each other, but it did not have an overarching government. The problem we had with that was foreign countries, especially in Europe, they were taking advantage of the United States diplomatically and in terms of trade. And so they wanted to form a federal government, one, to make sure we could have diplomatic relations to ensure that these countries didn't just steamroll states, and to make it so that we could, to avoid what the Founding Fathers called the bloody history of Europe. They didn't want wars between states like Europe saw throughout most of its history, right? Wars between countries, these little micronations constantly at war with each other. They didn't want that to be repeated in the United States. Now, the argument between state rights and federal rights came to a head during the Civil War. And the reason mainly was over slavery, right? It actually was. The technical argument for that, though, was state rights, because they said, how could the federal government tell us what is legal or illegal, because the laws are on the states? And some of the constitutional amendments that came out after the Civil War basically extended the role of the federal government quite a bit. And so the federal government has a lot more authority over states now, and states also are held to the Constitution, which state law debatably was not prior to that. Now, in some ways, that's a fantastic thing, in my opinion. I would like it so that a state cannot suppress my rights to free speech, for example. They need to respect the Bill of Rights. The downside of that, as many would argue, though, is that states have less ability to selectively enforce or whatever else laws that they agree with or disagree with. Now, when Biden was president, right? Well, I guess he still technically is, right? Until January 20th. Under the Biden administration, a lot of states have pushed back against him. Texas and Florida being some of the biggest examples of this. And one of the arguments was federal overreach. Republicans were talking about federal overreach. That was kind of deemed like an extremist narrative, where if you talk about federal overreach, they literally some people regard you as an extremist. The irony now, let's be honest, it's kind of ironic now that the Democrat states are going to be doing it, and will the same people who called Republicans extremists for saying that, will they still hold that narrative? Do they still think that's an extreme position? I personally, again, I don't think it's bad for this country to have legal debates over state rights. I don't think it's a bad argument to have. And again, people tend to like it when it's in their favor. They tend to hate it when it's against their favor. Case in point, how many of you supported Texas and Florida pushing back against federal government overreach? How many people will support California if they push back against what they regard as federal government overreach? I think it's just part of the debate this country's been having since the founding of the country, personally. But again, we'll see. We'll see, right? Friendly Zone 2706, you're saying Doge scares me. You're talking about the Department of Government Efficiency with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. You're saying why? Dr. Sowell's and his predecessor, Michael Friedman's observation. If you put the government in charge of the Sahara, there will soon be a shortage of sand. Yeah, I like that quote. You're saying if we have a Department of Government Efficiency, will that eliminate all efficiency? Well, so yeah, I understand that. Yeah. Some people would argue that if you want to see something stop working effectively, you make a government department to manage it. Back to Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell, right? Back to again, Austrian economics and so on, right? when you get into these arguments, what were they talking about? The big argument they had, talking about these individuals in particular you mentioned, who had that quote, the big argument they had was that the reason government tends to not be efficient is because they're not held, they don't need to make a customer happy, right? If you have a business providing a service, the business has to provide a good service or people don't buy their product. If they cannot compete on pricing, people don't buy it, they buy something else. If they don't like the product fails. If you try to sell something people don't want, you're not going to sell anything. And so they were arguing that businesses, they have an incentive to make good service, competitive pricing, and to do things in such a way that are effective. They argue that because government is not held to these standards, they don't have to sell you a product, they can subsidize things, and even if people don't want it, it's still going to be there. It doesn't matter how bad the service is. You can talk about, I won't name names here, but let's all think about some of these government services that you have to use to get, let's say, certain identifying documents and how effective you believe it may or may not be. Many people complain about the lack of customer service. And the reason is it doesn't matter because they have a monopoly, right? You have to go through them. There's nothing competing with them. They're not going to lose their jobs. They're not going to go out of business. There's nothing incentivizing quality, in other words. And so what Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are talking about is, so with this Department of Government Efficiency, and again, if you think it's going to work or not work, just, again, have your opinion, right? Tell me about it. The argument they have is they're going to be an advisory role. They're not technically going to be a government department. Even though they're calling it a department, it's not going to be a government department. It's like an advisory thing. What they're doing is making it so that government officials need to be accountable, and government officials can be fired if they're not accountable. And so what they're actually talking about is adopting free market principles for government positions. They're doing the opposite, in other words, of running it the way that government normally works. They're actually bringing in free market principles to it. Vivek Ramaswamy has actually been talking about this on X. Maybe tomorrow I'll go over this more because I think this maybe is an interesting conversation to have. They've been talking about this on X, suggesting that if government officials can be fired for not doing a good job, that means that those positions will be open and people can apply for those jobs, and they believe that it'll be based more on merit and not just how long you've been there for. And that maybe making government officials afraid that they're going to lose their jobs if they do not do a good job will force them to do a good job, or they risk being fired. They will be held to the same principles an employee at a normal company would be dealing with. And based on that argument, they believe it'll make it more effective. They'll also be looking at overspending on contracts. Some people have pointed out that, like a $50 bag of bolts, you can sell it to the government for like $700. There have been some really funny videos on this, for example. And so government contractors, for example, they tend to overcharge the government on a lot of things. They'll be looking at that. They'll also be looking at unnecessary spending. Anybody who's worked in a big corporation or a government agency understands that if you have a budget, you have to spend your entire budget. Why is that? Even if you don't need it, you need to spend it. Why is that? It's because the thinking is if you don't spend the budget, the next season, they're going to give you a reduced budget based on what you spent. And so if you need a budget and you don't use it all, you're going to lose it if you don't use it, right? And so that tends to create a culture. That tends to create a culture of unnecessary spending. Now, can they actually fix these problems? I mean, I don't know. I don't think we've seen anything like this before. I don't think we've ever seen this attempted before. But they're saying they're going to try to do it. We'll see whether it works. Again, you tell me if you think it's going to work or not. Again, I do read the comments. I think it's going to be interesting discussion at the very least. On that note, they're going to be ending it July 4th of 2026, right? 4th of July. And that's going to be interesting as well because 2026 is going to be the 150th anniversary of the United States. Or sorry, 250th anniversary of the United States. And Trump says for the 250th anniversary of the United States, he wants like a several-month celebration. Trump is going to have an America celebration for the 250th birthday of our country. And he wants to even bring back like the fairs and stuff where you have all these technological advancements and showing off the accomplishments of America. The World Fair, he wants to bring that back, but like the America Fair, that'll be a big thing happening at that time. And that seems to align as well with the Doge department. They're going to conclude on Independence Day 2026. Michael Florence, you're saying the government needs to be accountable to the people just like any other business. The accounting needs to balance. Yeah, and this has always been the challenge of government, like historically, right? Historically, this has always been the challenge of government. Great book on this, one of my favorites, in fact, The Law by Frederick Bastiat, talking about the nature of government, why government is created as a way to fight against what he defines as plunder. That people, the reason we form government among ourselves is to facilitate trade, is to, for example, why do we relate to each other? How does a free market work? Well, one guy cuts down trees for a living. He is a logger. Why is that a profitable business? It's because the builder buys wood from the logger. The guy who makes pencils buys wood from the logger. The guy who builds anything that needs wood buys wood from the logger. But to build certain products, like the analogy of the pencil, for example, you need the miner to go after the little metal part within the metallic part within the pencil, right? You need, for example, the rubber for the eraser, and so you need the guy harvesting rubber. You have kind of a division of labor that creates different social roles. You have the shoemaker, you have the clother, the guy who makes clothes, for example. You have people who create all the different products that build everything that we have that forms a civilization. The issue you have with trade and a society like that, though, is there will always be people who try to steal it. There will always be people who say, well, I don't feel like working. I'm just going to go rob that guy. I'm just going to steal from this person. And they form gangs. They form raiding tribes. If you go back to tribalism, they make it so that you can't have a society that is safe from plunder. And so, in order to protect people from plunder, honest people among themselves, form a type of defensive agreement. That is the most basic form of government. And that defensive agreement will defend them against plunder. The challenge you have is that as that defensive agreement grows, it starts representing different interests. If you expand it to include many different areas, including different regions, different tribes, people are tribal by nature unless you unite them under a common system, different tribes, different religions, different beliefs, then you need to have a government capable of encompassing all these different types of people. And as it gets bigger, the risk you face, as Frederick Bastiat would note, is that it begins using the powers to fight plunder to also engage in plunder itself. And when you get to areas of excessive taxation, the concern is that basically the people who would be the raiders and the people who would be the bandits, they might get the positions of power and use the arms of government to commit plunder under the protections of the government. They might collaborate with the government to get kickbacks. Some would argue that maybe not in all senses, but in some regards, the social welfare system represents a type of that, where a person who just doesn't feel like working, instead of robbing people, he could just get, a welfare check. Some would argue it's the same thing. And all of it works through some form of plunder, because the money comes from you and I. It comes from the labor we create, right? That kind of agreement we had where we don't want to get robbed as we go about our business, which is the fundamental reason we formed the government in the first place, right? And so if we get robbed one way or the other, that's the problem you face if you don't have a properly regulated government, right? And that's the big concern. Frederick Bastiat believed that the socialists were basically a government of plunder, and he had criticized actually a lot of the early socialists in the French Revolution. It's a fantastic book, actually. Again, if you want to read it, it's called The Law by Frederick Bastiat. Folks, thank you so much for being here. Again, please share this episode. Like the video if you're on Rumble or YouTube or anywhere else. We do really appreciate it. Share the video. Again, we're trying to break through censorship, and maybe now that Trump is saying he's going to try to break censorship, we can do it finally. So we've been censored for like 4 years. It's crazy. Maybe it's coming to an end though. So thank you so much for being here. Folks, I really appreciate all of you. Join me again tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. I'll be going over some of the. There's so much news right now. I have to be kind of selective with it. I want to talk about some of the big changes that have been happening recently, some of the big news. So join me tomorrow. We'll have a pretty broad discussion on what's been happening in the country. And again, we'll answer your questions. Have a great discussion as always, and I will see you then. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.